What happened to Fulgrim is so horrendous, so disgusting, and so over-the-top grimdark that when I really think about it, it kind of makes me want to retch a little. Yeah, the Phoenician is who we're talking about today, and he's one of the best Primarchs in all of Warhammer 40K. An amazing character, both before and after his extremely hard fall. But is he just a metaphor for all of our own dark sides? For whatever secret hedonistic thing that we each keep from the world around us, but we can't live without? I don't know. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a YouTuber. But what I do know is that when it comes to Primarchs and Legions, the Phoenician and the Emperor's Children are a lot of fun. Featuring an Index Astartes in 2001's issue 255 of White Dwarf, if I recall correctly, the hedonistic followers of Slaanesh had me hooked from then on. Back in the early 2000s, those Index Astartes articles were often some of the deepest dives into the faction we had up until then. Usually we'd get the models and just a few paragraphs in a codex. But now there's a ton to know and a lot of lore, more than 20 years of it, and we can look at it. And when it comes to Fulgrim, some of the things he's done and some of the things that have happened to him are so extreme, it's stomach churning. And somehow, also a little intriguing at the same time, if you're a pervert. So cut yourself out a line of the dirtiest space coke distilled from the pituitary glands of a trillion virgin psychers and grab your space lube, because this is going to be one hell of a kinky one as we're heading right up to Slaaneshmas. Sorry for that last paragraph. I know it was a bit too much, but so is Slaanesh, and you're just going to have to deal with it. Now Fulgrim. The Palatine Phoenix was pretty much perfection. He was smart, he was strong, skilled, well-tempered, and could be both wrathful and respectful. But he was so full of himself. Like, he was really bad. And in my opinion, it was made so much worse after he met his father, the Emperor. Fulgrim was the kind of guy who could be put into a terrible situation and come through it and make it better, which is exactly what he did with the world that he was scattered to when the baby Primarchs were flung through the warp, Chemos. A dark world in perpetual twilight where the entire population had to endlessly toil to barely scrape by, and their very survival hinged on their mining. But after the baby Primarch was found, he became the youngest miner, and eventually, in true Primarch fashion, he took over. Starting as a slave, he went on to become a ruler, eventually defeating the other factions on Chemos and uniting its people. Fulgrim upped mining production to the point where Chemos had a surplus and was able to trade for food and other goods. Eventually, the society was able to shift, and things like the arts and science and music all came back and flourished. Once people didn't have to spend money every hour of every day just trying to survive, things got pretty good for the populace of Chemos. And ultimately, that's who Fulgrim is deep down. He's the guy who takes something dull and oppressive and breathes life into it. But eventually, the Emperor of Mankind came down to Chemos, and he landed in his Aquila Stormbird and was met by the police force of Chemos. They took Big E to Fulgrim, who just saw his father and fell to his knees immediately, prostrating himself before the Master of Mankind and pledging absolute fealty. And it made sense then why Fulgrim was perfection incarnate, why he did everything so well, why he was so smart and such a consummate fighter. Fulgrim was a son of the Emperor and a veritable demigod in his own right. The Primarch was destined for something great, for something extreme, and for something terrible. But he was unaware of any of it. Fulgrim was simply just compelled to follow. Unlike a lot of Primarch reunions with the Emperor, Fulgrim's went very smoothly. It was certainly a positive experience, unlike some of the other Primarchs who turned traitor and eventually became demons, such as Mortarion and Angron. But when Fulgrim inherited his warriors, he only got 200 guys, due to a catastrophe known as the Blight that was ruining their gene seed. So Fulgrim was determined to still make a go of it, though, and decided his 200 guys were going to kick as much ass as anyone else's guys. They eventually impressed the Emperor enough that the 3rd Legion was named the Emperor's Children by the Master of Mankind himself, and they were granted the incredible accolade of being allowed to display the Emperor's personal symbol, the Aquila, on the breastplates of their power armor. In the current Warhammer 40K setting, this is standard. Nearly every Space Marine has the Aquila proudly displayed across their chest. But back then, during the Great Crusade, the honor was for the 3rd Legion alone, and they earned it because the Emperor's children, under their amazingly charismatic and witty Primarch, were an absolute force. But he was at first relegated to serving under his brother Horus. Because his legion was so small, and I believe the Emperor didn't want to just send out 200 guys and see them get wiped out. A total party kill would look bad when it was one of his 20 legions and not just some PDF or Imperial Guard unit. Now that Fulgrim was found, the legion could be replenished at a much more rapid rate as his gene seed was readily available. So new legionnaires were created from aspirants from both Terra and Chemos. Eventually the Emperor's children were brought up to fighting strength, but it did take a few decades. And as for the Phoenix himself, Fulgrim's pride swelled beyond even where it was before. He was a prince of the universe, the Emperor's perfect son, a paragon of humanity. Yeah, Fulgrim's already massive ego and narcissism. Well, let's just say that it made his head swell up like Mr. Mackey. And the Emperor granted him a fleet of his own, the 28th Expeditionary Fleet of the Great Crusade. And Fulgrim just tore through worlds, bringing them into compliance, becoming routine for him as he made his way through the galaxy. It was obvious that his years serving with Horus and his legion being attached to the Luna Wolves left its mark on Fulgrim's style of warfare and leadership techniques. He, being the massive egomaniac that he was, really wanted to prove he was the best Primarch that ever Primarched and could out-Primarch even the other Primarchs who were Primarchs among even the Primarchs. You get my point. Now, everything about Fulgrim was a flex. From his uniquely ornate armor called the Gilded Panoply to his extreme physical beauty, even his Primarch aura was strong and magnetic. Fulgrim was the embodiment of perfection, even in his physical form. But the way he weaponized his charisma and his flashiness foreshadowed his downfall. He's like one of those guys who places a lot of importance on showing off, having status symbols, etc., but this was all just hiding a deep, underlying insecurity. Let's just say he wore a lot of high collars. And for this Primarch in particular, it wasn't a matter of nurture, it was a matter of nature, which turned him ultimately to chaos. Fulgrim's entire personality was primed from the get-go for him to become exactly what he did in the end. And that is not his fault, nor his father's, for once at least. Fulgrim was neither neglected nor betrayed by the Emperor. His early days on Chemos were not easy, certainly. He was indeed enslaved. But did he have it bad as far as Primarchs go? Especially compared to some of his other brothers that turned to chaos who were actually good people at heart, like Angron and Horus? Now, one of my favorite things about Fulgrim is that he was married several times, always for political reasons, to unite one faction or another, etc., as he was rising through the ranks of Chemos' society. And I think it is very telling that he believes that he loved each one, at first, but always grew bored with them and ceased to care. Then they just grow old anyway, and he was effectively immortal. But I do think it kind of gives you a glimpse into the deeper aspects of the guy. Like a lot of psychopaths, narcissists, and sociopaths, he tells himself he's a good guy and that he's caring and does the right thing. But it's all just for protecting his self. And by self, I mean very fragile self-image. Because Fulgrim's greatest weakness, like any narcissist's, is himself. Someone who is entirely all ego like that, and thrust into such a position of galactic scale power, well, it sowed the seeds of Fulgrim's downfall long before he fell to Slaanesh. He basically was born with the exact right personality to develop all the addictions he would come to revel in, and may have proven to be a liability, even had he not embraced the god of excess and hedonism. Now, he was very competitive and quite a shit talker, especially with Ferrus Manus, who became his best friend. They were all boasts and banter and back and forth ripping on each other until they basically developed an unbreakable bond. And all of this happened on Terra as they forged, literally trying to have a forge-off to see who's the better, two of the most master-crafted weapons ever developed. Fulgrim claimed Ferrus's sword Fireblade was the better weapon, and Ferrus claimed it was Fulgrim's hammer Forgebreaker that was the winner. Either way, they had a super bro-off moment and swapped weapons, becoming best friends forever. And it must be said that out of all the Primarchs, I considered these two to have been the closest of friends. Perhaps Sanguinius and Horus's friendship was on that level, but yeah, two demigods who share an unbreakable bond. For many of the Primarchs, they couldn't stand most of their brothers, so Fulgrim and Ferris's friendship really does stand out. Now, when the Emperor's children finally hit the ground running and participated in the Great Crusade, they obsessed over facing worthy foes. Time after time, they'd subjugate worlds, and it would be too easy an accomplishment for them. And this is where boredom, however small at first, set in. And it is this boredom and the dulling of life's luster in general that I believe ultimately led to the damnation of both the Primarch and the Legion. But very early on, the Third Legion did meet a foe they found worthy, the alien race known as the Lair, a reptilian Xenos race who lived on Laren, a water-covered world with floating coral cities. They were, much like the Emperor's children themselves, great practitioners of the arts and respected refinement, beauty, and perfection. This snake-like race had applied all of those concepts to its own physiology and augmented themselves. They had bioengineered themselves and bionically enhanced themselves, and this was not lost on Fulgrim. But what was lost on him and his legion was they should not have rushed to attack the Lair as they did. Horus actually told Fulgrim not to, saying that the resources of the world, while vast, would exact too high a toll on the legions to seize. But Fulgrim didn't listen. He wanted glory. The race of aliens were extremely badass and put up one hell of a fight that Fulgrim absolutely reveled in, a worthy foe that facing would prove that his legion was the equal of any other. If he could exterminate the Lair, then the accolades would be plenty. Fulgrim might get a nice shiny medal pinned on his chest by the Emperor himself and told he's the greatest in front of all the other Primarchs, and that is just the kind of ego stroking that Fulgrim got off on. So that meant that he went in alone. He did not wait for other Space Marines to come back up the Emperor's children, he just rushed in to fight them. And yes, he took them out, but at a very high cost. Way too many of his Adeptus Astartes were killed in the fighting, seriously diminishing his legion's strength in a way that was out of balance with the gains made by taking the planet. After all, what was humanity going to do with an all-water planet? We couldn't live on it. The only habitable areas were all kept up by the use of Xenos, forbidden to humans, technology. Yeah, Fulgrim really had no reason to even fight the Lair, not on any real level. But that isn't the tragedy. Sure, the useless loss of life, the extermination of advanced species, was tragic. But this is where Fulgrim finally comes into contact with chaos and begins to lose everything. At the center of the main heart of the Lair society, they had a temple. The Emperor's children had to fight tooth and nail to enter it, as the main Lair resistance was centered there. And Fulgrim entered to the scene of a snake orgy. The Lair who remained were all the last of their race, and it seemed that the reptilians sacrificed themselves as an entire species and focused that into the master-crafted sword at the heart of the temple. The Emperor's children massacred the remaining snake people, and Fulgrim seized the blade of the Lair, and unwittingly became influenced by the Keeper of Secrets that had been summoned and bound within it. So Fulgrim came into possession of a blade that held a greater demon within it, and he was still ignorant of the fact that demons exist. Now, over time, the blade would whisper the most messed up things to Fulgrim, and he would just assume that it was his subconscious just getting very, very dark. He wasn't really able to reason what was right in front of him. He is, after all, a narcissist, so assumed the voices in his head were his own. After all, who would have the power to penetrate the mind of a Primarch? Nobody, or so Fulgrim assumed. Now, this blade was in his hand or on his waist at all the most inopportune moments, whispering its seductive secrets into the Primarch's mind's darkest corners. And he was turning on his most loyal friends, advisors, and confidants, and his mind spiraled out of control with paranoia. This blade resulted in Fulgrim basically developing borderline schizophrenia, as his paranoia became absolutely overwhelming. Fulgrim was seen more often wielding and carrying the Lair blade than he was seen with his own master-crafted power sword forged by his brother Ferris, Fireblade. Whenever the Primarch was without the possessed blade of the Lair, somehow one of his subordinates would bring it to him and kid him out with it. And this was at its worst when Fulgrim and the Emperor's children were called in as reinforcements when the Iron Hands and Ferris Manus were facing a coalition of humans and aliens known as the Diasporex. One that was giving them some real problems. or as my old roommate would have said, they were giving him a lot of guff. The Diasporex humans refused to leave their alien allies and join the Imperium, and so, based on the rules upon which they were persecuting the Emperor's will, the Primarchs decided to wipe them out. At first, they don't know why the Diasporex won't leave the sector and flee to a safer area, but eventually, they discovered that the coalition of humans and aliens are using the local star as a fuel source and had a series of solar collectors. The Imperial fleets attacked the solar arrays, and the Diasporex came out of hiding, totally taking the bait. And these guys were no slouches when it came to war. The Diasporex were amazing at naval warfare, and even able to cripple some of Ferris's ships, such as the strike cruiser Ferrum. The coalition of humans and Xenos put up one hell of a fight. Fulgrim's gunship, his personal ship, the Firebird, came under heavy attack and things looked grim. But Ferris rushed to his brother's side, with his flagship, the Fist of Iron, basically saving Fulgrim. And Fulgrim was pissed. In response, he led a boarding action against the Diasporex and just absolutely massacred his way through the enemy troops. But Solomon Demeter got to the bridge first and slew everyone. The Diasporex commander said, "We only wish to be left alone." When Fulgrim arrived, he was pissed again. He wanted the glory of ending the fight and slaying the enemy's commanders. And just because one of the Marines got there and did his job before he could, Fulgrim felt slighted. And then he throws a tantrum and is pissed at Ferris Manus for saving him. He doesn't see it clearly for the altruistic act of heroism it was. He thinks that Ferris had some ulterior motive or some hidden agenda in saving him. It got pretty silly. Fulgrim obviously needed help. If you've ever had a family member addicted to meth, then you'll know what Ferris was going through. Fulgrim had changed and was buying into his own bullshit. Over the following months, Fulgrim felt that his brother, who had lost a ton of guys saving his ass, saved him for his own glory, not to actually help Fulgrim. Fulgrim had been treading a path toward damnation, and neither he nor his brother Ferris, nor his Emperor's children, could see it. Oh, and for those of you who are wondering, what about Bekwa Kinska and her Maraviglia? Well, that will be in a video specifically about the Emperor's children, and I will get to it. But, got to keep the focus on the Primarch in this video. So one of my favorite scenes in all of the Horus Heresy is where Fulgrim meets with the Eldar Farseer, Eldred Ulthrin. The Space Elf Wizard tries to warn Fulgrim, and he's being straight up honest. But at first, he doesn't realize that Fulgrim is under the influence of Slaanesh. So he's telling Fulgrim that Horus got stabbed by the Kennebrak Anathame, a dagger corrupted by Nurgle, the Chaos God. And Fulgrim is like, "What's a Chaos God? What's a Nurgle?" Eldred starts to explain it, but as he's doing so, if I remember this correctly, he realizes that Fulgrim is ever so slightly coming under Slaanesh's influence, and he knows he's made a terrible mistake. Battle ensues, and the Emperor's children, I believe it was the Phoenix Guard specifically, ravaged the Eldar. Fulgrim was provoked by the Lair Blade to attack, as he goaded him on, telling him that the Eldari were lying and trying to trick him, that Horus would never get corrupted by a poop knife, etc. All a bunch of paranoid garbage, but he bought into it, and, unprovoked, attacked. He killed a Wraith Lord, which when I read it was a big deal to me, as my Wraith Lord was never defeated, not even once in 3rd edition. Yeah, it may have been broken as hell, but it was the strongest model in all of Warhammer 40K at the time. So in my mind, I was like, holy crap, this guy smashed a Wraith Lord, his guys killed all the Farseer's retinue, and he then goes toe-to-toe with an avatar of Cain. Well, I'm pretty sure that the kid from Space King 2, even with his treads, could take an avatar the way they write them in the lore. But yeah, he chokes it to death, which I thought was weird. But okay, hell of a Primarch move if you ask me. But of course, Eldred Ulthrin, being the Eldar's main character, gets away to live and fight another day, and show up in more Horus Heresy novels later. So Fulgrim goes to Horus, his brother who he is closest with next to Ferris Manus. And Horus has an 18 charisma on a bad day. He's easily able to turn the corrupted Fulgrim fully to his cause and against the Emperor. Fulgrim just had to be sold the line that chaos is the avenue through which humanity, and he himself, would be able to achieve perfection. Yeah, for whatever reason, perfection was still something Fulgrim constantly obsessed over. So, he cast aside the imperial truth and fully turned to chaos. It was a slow drip, but in the end, he made a conscious choice to accept it. Then Horus sends Fulgrim to meet with Ferris, because if anyone can sway the Gorgon to the War Master's side, it is Fulgrim, his best friend. And well, that went pretty poorly. Of course, Ferris Manus didn't take any of what Fulgrim had to say very well. He flew into a rage, a very violent rage, backed up by a ton of self-righteousness and vitriol. He was intent on murdering Fulgrim right there, aboard the Fist of Iron in the Anvilarium, and nearly did so. It was all Ferris could manage to do. He needed to put down the rebellion right then, right there. The ensuing battle was fierce, and Fulgrim almost got Ferris. But Ferris was able to grab Fulgrim's sword, Fireblade, the very sword Ferris had gifted him. But his necrodermis arms and the sword reacted, and it exploded in his grip. The Primarchs were flung back from one another, and Ferris was unconscious. Fulgrim, hearing the whispers of the Keeper of Secrets in his lair blade, goading him on to finish his brother. And he nearly did so. But he was able to resist, and he never wanted to harm his brother, only convince him of his newfound truth. Fulgrim hefted the hammer Forge Breaker and took it, instead of smashing Ferris's head in, as the demon blade suggested. He left the shattered pieces of Fireblade for his brother, and exited the inner sanctum of the Iron Hands Primarch. And then the Phoenix Guard killed, by decapitation, all the Morlocks who were Ferris's bodyguard that were there. Fulgrim fled to his shuttle, the Firebird, and went back to his flagship. Then his fleet opened up on the Iron Hands fleet, causing massive damage before the Emperor's children split. Fulgrim had failed to convert Ferris, and this did not please the War Master. Eventually, the Emperor's children would take part in the events of Istvan III and Istvan V, and it was there, at the fifth planet in the system, when Horus sprung his ultimate trap that ruined 3 of the Loyalist legions entirely, that Fulgrim finally came face to face with Ferris again. The battle was insane. I really suggest you guys read this one for yourselves. But the fighting got up close, hand to hand, as the Morlocks and Ferris made a final stand. Ultimately, Fulgrim didn't really realize he was possessed, and in the end was unable to stay his hand, despite both his brain and his heart telling him to. And he slew Ferris Manus in single combat, lopping his brother's head right off. And Fulgrim had a moment of clarity. He was aggrieved, he was repentant, he was regretful, and he was a fratricidal murderer. The lair blade called to him, seducing him, and he was unable to resist it. Fulgrim tried to kill himself, about to stab himself through the heart, but the blade would not let him. It insisted that he remain alive, and offered him a new level of damnation. Fulgrim accepted, not just chaos, but found his patron in the god of excess, pleasure, and pain, Slaanesh. The greater demon took over his body, basically displacing and replacing his soul. Fulgrim was trapped in a tiny pocket within his own mind, shut out and unable to control his body in any way, but was aware of what the demon was doing, which the demon really got off on. Ultimately, Fulgrim's soul would be trapped within a painting of himself that hung in the auditorium aboard his battle barge, the Pride of the Emperor. The very auditorium where the Meraviglia was performed by the remembrancer/composer Bekwa Kinska, who was corrupted upon Laren along with Fulgrim and his marines. But, like I said earlier, that's for another video. But this painting is made of bodily fluids, painted with blood, semen, feces, and other things that are byproducts of human existence. To say it is gross is a huge understatement. Still, it is rendered in an exquisite and unique perfection, absolutely detailed. Horus could tell his brother was possessed. Immediately, he knew it, but he still wanted the Third Legion on his side, so struck a deal to keep the secret so long as the demon served him in the same capacity that Fulgrim would have. They agreed. There was a bit more to it than that, but you get the point. So this greater demon of Slaanesh is puppeting Fulgrim around, using his body. 4 days after the Istvan V drop site massacre, Horus gathered the traitor Primarchs for the first time aboard the Vengeful Spirit. And it was very interesting. Not all were physically present. Kurz and Alpharius, I believe, were holograms, attending through FaceTime. while Magnus was a psychic projection, but the rest were there. And Lorgar loses his absolute shit. He knows that it isn't Fulgrim. He knows that the body is a soulless husk piloted by an abomination. He whips out his Crozius and smashes Fulgrim with it, sending him into the wall. And none could stand before Lorgar. He was swole with the powers of the warp. Horus tried to calm him, and Lorgar was so strong psychically that Horus was forced to remove his hand from Lorgar's shoulder. Eventually they talked, and Lorgar was pissed that Horus knew such a secret and kept it from the Primarchs, stating that the Gal Vorbak, his own possessed marines, were not such an abomination because they still retained their own souls. But whatever happened to Fulgrim needed to be ended. Horus agreed that it was bad, but assured Lorgar he was planning to release Fulgrim from his torment as soon as he could. But Lucius, a captain of the Emperor's children, saw through the demon's ploy, and he led his warrior lodge to capture Fulgrim and try to remove the demon from him. Eventually, after much blood was spilled, the officers of the Emperor's children were able to subdue and restrain Fulgrim, who had been knocked unconscious. And well, they tried to remove the demon through a process called excruciation. They tried to torture it out of him, and in the process discovered that it was actually Fulgrim, that he had subdued the demon and had switched places with it, locking it in the painting, and that he had been enacting an elaborate ruse to get everyone to think he was still the demon, for whatever reason. He did love being tortured, though. He forgave his sons for doing it to him immediately, but yeah, he totally got off on it, a sign of his Slaaneshi corruption. Now, one thing that Horus did was he gifted the hammer Forgebreaker to Perturabo as a boon, and to try to curry favor with the Lord of Iron. I always thought that was lame of him to jack Fulgrim like that, but he did nonetheless, so now Perturabo wields the hammer. But Fulgrim used Perturabo in an elaborate ruse, tricking him to believe that there was a secret WMD called the Angel Exterminatus in the Eye of Terror. He called for the Emperor's children and Iron Warriors to join forces and seek the artifact. This is where Slaanesh's forked tongue was in action, as Fulgrim stated that it was going to make all of Perturabo's desires come true, and in a way that would be most satisfying for him. He'd finally be fulfilled. But it was all a fake-out, a scheme to ascend to demonhood, under his own conditions, not being possessed by a keeper of secrets. Fulgrim attempted to sacrifice his brother Perturabo to achieve apotheosis, and he nearly succeeded in that sacrifice by using a trick involving a Magatar stone that sapped Perturabo's strength. It's a pretty insane scene and goes pretty deep. They fight Eldar constructs and the Iron Hands, survivors of the Drop Site Massacre, along with a few salamanders and a single Raven Guard. The Raven Guard, Naakona Sharokin, realized that Fulgrim desired the stone and shot it with a bolter. This reinvigorated Perturabo, who got his strength back, and he hefted Forgebreaker and absolutely smashed Fulgrim, obliterating his body. And Fulgrim didn't care. He got his apotheosis. On an Eldar crone world within the Eye of Terror, Fulgrim ascended to demonhood. The ritual he was conducting didn't care that he was the sacrifice, or his brother Perturabo. And Perty thought that he'd killed Fulgrim, but the Phoenix rose from the ashes, a twisted, snake-like demon with 4 arms and bat wings, a horrific, truly gorgeous, absolutely hedonistic image sculpted by Slaanesh himself. And that is how Fulgrim became what he is today. And he's been more or less silent since then, coming out only occasionally from his pleasure planet in the Eye of Terror. Fulgrim is not seen often in the lore anymore. He did, however, slit Gilliman's throat, so that's a really big deal. And he's in the Eidolon book, still running what he can, but his sons are all such a bunch of self-righteous hedonists that they're incapable of acting as one unified force anymore. And don't worry, we'll get to Eidolon in a future video too. It's in the works. Fulgrim does seem to be the one that Teke the Smiling One is directly working for in the Bequin books, so he is active, just operating behind the scenes so far. But everything is primed, and the stage is set for his epic and glorious return to the setting. He'll be center stage in the unfolding narrative that is about to drop in a few months, and I, for one, cannot wait. But how has 10,000 years of demonhood affected the Primarch? Here's a little excerpt from the novel Manflayer about Fabius Bile, who I had forgotten to mention actually cloned Fulgrim at one point, and the clone was loyal and repentant. "Oh, Fabius, really, the arrogance of you." Fulgrim reached up and plucked a piece of fruit from a hanging vine. He took a bite, and dark juices ran down his chin and chest. You never left the trap, boy. The moment you set foot in the Lair Temple, you were caught fast, the same as the rest of us. Granted, your desires took a more circuitous form than I might have predicted, but the end result is the same. You are no less a slave to your lusts than any of your brothers. And are you a slave as well, father? Fulgrim took another bite of fruit, giving every sign of relishing the taste. I was born a slave, Fabius, and even after I took Chemos, I was still a slave. The anathema came and made all my accomplishments as ashes. He gestured with a juice-stained claw. That is the story of us. We are tools, made for a purpose. We were no more in control of our destinies than your scuttling vatborn. When I realized this, I knew that the only true freedom lay in choosing my own master. Now, one thing I really want to emphasize is just how repentant Fulgrim really is. He questions his decisions many times, and even though he puts up a front of absolute devotion to Slaanesh and belief that he did the right thing, he doesn't believe that himself. Fulgrim hates himself for what he's done, for betraying his father, for killing his brother and best friend, or at least he did before he achieved his Demon Primarch status. I'm really hoping that we see not just a return of the Snake Demon guy, but also of the noble Fulgrim, possibly in the form of his clone. Who would be better to confront an absolute narcissist than himself? Anyway, that's a wrap, folks. This one went a little longer than usual, and as always, will be appearing in a compilation video along with some of his brother Primarchs. This time, Magnus and the Lion, maybe Vulcan. Shout out to my channel members. You guys rock. Thanks for your support. It really does mean the world to me.